It was barely 6 in the morning when I stepped out onto my porch, coffee mug in hand, expecting birdsong and peace, but instead, I saw a middle-aged woman in a leopard print bathrobe pointing aggressively at my fence while a construction crew unloaded a metal gate from a flatbed truck. I blinked twice, thinking I must still be half asleep. But no. There was Karen. Yes, that Karen from the HOA, waving papers and barking orders at men who looked just as confused as I was. Within 20 minutes, they had cut into my side fence and began drilling what looked like a literal access gate into my backyard. At 7, the gate swung open with a clang. By 8, Karen was walking her teacup poodle through the gate into my yard like she'd just unlocked a new public park. And by 9, I realized this wasn't just another HOA stunt, it was a full-blown invasion. I stood frozen, still in my sweatpants, clutching my coffee like it might somehow explain what I was seeing. My dog, Rocky, a 90-pound mutt with the bark of a freight train, was going ballistic at the sliding door, furious that someone, some stranger, had breached his territory. I calmed him down, stepped outside, and walked right up to the newly installed gate that now sat flush against the edge of my garden bed. Karen, who was inspecting her dog's poop like it was a wine tasting, turned and greeted me with a smile that could sour milk. "Oh, hi there. Isn't it just lovely? The shortcut's going to be so convenient. I had them match the metal to the HOA trail signs, see? It's cohesive." I stared at her, blinking. "You put a gate in my fence. Into my backyard." "Well, technically it's a shared access point," she said, holding up some papers like they were gospel. "The HOA has an easement clause, totally standard. It allows for community access when necessary." I took the papers from her hand and scanned them. They were HOA bylaws, sure, but the clause she was referencing was about utility companies accessing underground lines, not building a literal gate into someone's private yard so she could shave 30 seconds off her walk to the community trail. I held the papers up. "Karen, this says the HOA has to notify homeowners in writing and obtain written consent before doing anything to private structures." "Well, it's not like I drilled it myself," she laughed, waving her hand. "The board approved it. You weren't at the last meeting. Because I was out of town and I never received notice." She clapped her hands like she was congratulating a toddler. "Exactly. You missed it. So, the board voted and it passed. We just assumed you wouldn't mind. It'll really add to community flow." At that moment, her dog lifted a leg on my lawn gnome, and Karen didn't even blink. I turned and walked away before I said something I'd regret, but my jaw was clenched so hard I could hear my teeth creak. Back inside, I called Luis, my buddy from college who now worked as a municipal attorney. I snapped a few photos of the gate, the workers, and Karen's smug face, then sent him everything with a note. "Tell me this isn't legal." 5 minutes later, Luis called laughing. "Not only is it not legal, it's a lawsuit waiting to happen. They altered a private fence, built a gate, and trespassed. That's a trifecta of nope. Can I rip it out?" "Not yet," he said. "Document everything. Record your conversations. And don't touch the gate until we get a cease and desist filed. But yeah, you're sitting on a goldmine of liability here." Later that day, I stood by the gate with my phone in my pocket recording, as Karen pranced back through with a group of HOA ladies in tow. They walked right across my grass like it was a public trail. One of them even complimented my hydrangeas before stepping directly on them. I didn't interrupt, I wanted the recording. Karen, of course, led the charge, pointing to her new, convenient access, like she was giving a real estate tour. "This way's much faster than walking around the block," she said. "And I think the community will really appreciate having a direct route." "Community?" I asked. "Karen, this is my backyard, not a footpath." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said with a chuckle. "We're just being neighborly." The moment they left, I walked the perimeter of my yard, feeling violated. This wasn't just a gate. It was a breach. It was someone claiming space that didn't belong to them and daring you to stop them. That night, I sat with Rocky on the porch, watching the moonlight hit that shiny new gate, and I knew one thing for sure. Karen thought she'd won. She thought her little power play would go unanswered. But she was wrong. Luis came over that evening with printouts, official property line maps, and a bottle of scotch. He laid out the legal options, but more importantly, he sparked an idea. While talking about remedies and mitigation structures, he offhandedly said, "You know, technically, you could build a wall on your side. As long as it follows height code, there's nothing they can say. Might block that little shortcut though." I laughed at first, but the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. A wall. Not just any wall, a big, beautiful, red brick monument to personal space. A symbol. A message. A legal way to say, "Stay out of my damn yard." That night, I stayed up researching city code. I learned that anything under 8 feet required no permit in my county, as long as it was on private property. I also found a local crew that did night construction for commercial projects. Quiet, efficient, and used to working off hours. I contacted them under an alias, told them it was a surprise anniversary gift for my wife, and asked how fast they could install an 8-foot decorative brick wall. They said 3 nights. I said I needed it in 1. By the time I finished planning, the sun was rising again. I looked out the window, saw Karen already unlocking the gate, sipping from her thermos, and I smiled for the first time in 24 hours. Let her enjoy it while it lasts. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The bricks were coming. And the next time Karen came through my yard, she'd find herself staring at a wall so high and so perfectly legal, she'd need a ladder just to regret her choices. The next day, I wasted no time. With my plan finalized and my resolve even stronger after seeing Karen march through my backyard like she was leading a neighborhood parade, I set everything into motion. First, I called the brick supplier Luis had recommended. I told them I needed high-quality red bricks, weather-sealed, and enough to cover a 10-foot wide section of fence with an 8-foot-high structure. The supplier asked when I wanted them delivered. I said tonight. He paused, probably thinking I was building a panic room, but agreed for an extra fee. I paid it without hesitation. Next, I contacted the construction crew, a group of night shift workers who specialized in high-speed commercial build-out. They were used to rushing jobs in parking lots, warehouses, and industrial zones. No questions asked. I told them exactly what I needed. Brick wall, decorative top edge, vertical iron support bars embedded for structural integrity, all in one night, starting at 11 p.m. They said it was insane. I said it was urgent. I offered a bonus for every hour ahead of schedule. They were in. I spent the rest of the day pretending to garden while discreetly marking out measurements with spray chalk on my side of the fence. Rocky watched me with a confused look, unsure if we were starting a home renovation or burying a body. Karen made her usual gate appearance around 3 in the afternoon. This time, she had a friend with her, someone who looked just as self-righteous, both of them sipping smoothies and walking through my backyard like it was a dog park. They didn't even look at me as they passed. Just giggled and complimented each other's shoes while Rocky growled low behind the glass door. That was the final straw. I was done watching my space be treated like a shortcut. Tonight, I'd turn her shortcut into a monument of resistance. At exactly 10:50 p.m., a pair of trucks pulled into my driveway with their lights off. The crew of 4 stepped out like ninjas, all in dark work gear, each carrying toolboxes and gloves. No one spoke above a whisper. I led them to the backyard, showed them the layout, and gave them the green light. Within minutes, they'd unloaded the bricks, mixed mortar in a portable barrel, and gotten to work. The first clang of a sledgehammer hitting metal made Rocky jump, but it was music to my ears. The gate didn't stand a chance. They didn't just remove it, they dismantled it like it never existed, loading every piece into the back of a truck so there'd be no evidence. By midnight, the space was cleared, the ground leveled, and the first row of bricks was going down. I stood there watching like a proud director behind the scenes of his magnum opus. The crew worked like a machine, each man knowing exactly where to be, which brick to pass, when to adjust angles and height. The wall began to take shape quicker than I could have imagined. As it rose, layer by layer, I started to feel something I hadn't felt since this whole HOA nonsense started: peace. I made them coffee halfway through the night, and even offered my Bluetooth speaker so they could play music low while they worked. The lead mason, a guy named Derek, grinned and said, "I've built walls for warehouses, prisons, even a nightclub once, but never to stop a neighbor." I laughed and told him this was probably more of a psychological barrier than a physical one. "Those are the best kind," he said, laying another perfect row. By 4 in the morning, the wall was nearly complete. 8 feet tall, capped with stone edges that gave it a polished, stately look. I had asked for a built-in iron trellis arch over the top to make it less fortress-like and more garden-themed, and Derek delivered. The finishing touch was a small brass sign I had custom-made the day before. It read, "Private property. Do not enter." It gleamed under the motion light I had temporarily set up for the crew. When the final brick was tapped into place just before sunrise, I stood back, arms folded, and admired it. It wasn't just a wall. It was a declaration. And it was beautiful. The crew left at dawn, quietly disappearing like ghosts. I took a quick shower and sat out front with my coffee, waiting for the moment. It didn't take long. At 7:15 sharp, Karen came through the HOA walking trail like clockwork. She turned the corner, holding her poodle on a rhinestone leash and humming to herself. Then she saw it. Her jaw dropped so hard I half expected it to shatter on the ground. Where her gate had been, where her shortcut once lived, now stood an immovable, solid red wall, proudly blocking any and all passage. Her dog barked. She didn't move. Just stared, dumbfounded, like she couldn't quite process the betrayal of physics happening in front of her. I stepped out onto my porch and offered a cheerful wave. "Morning, Karen. Lovely day, isn't it?" She finally snapped out of her daze and stormed toward me, stopping just short of the wall. "What is this?" she demanded. "A wall," I said casually. "You built a gate into my yard without permission. I figured I'd make the property lines clearer." "You can't do that," she hissed. "This is illegal. This is against the HOA codes. You're going to regret this." I walked down to the edge of the lawn and pointed to the property map taped neatly to the side of the wall, laminated and everything. "Actually, it's fully within my rights. Luis, you remember Luis? He helped me with all the paperwork. 8 feet tall. On my property. Meets decorative structure code. Completely legal." Karen sputtered. "You'll hear from the HOA about this." I shrugged. "I already did. 3 months ago when I moved in. I didn't hear a word from them when you put in the gate. Interesting how that works." She stood there, fuming, her poodle now barking uncontrollably. She yanked its leash, stormed back the way she came, and I couldn't help but smile. Rocky was wagging his tail wildly behind the glass, no longer barking, just observing his kingdom restored. By noon that day, I received an email from the HOA requesting an urgent meeting to discuss recent modifications. Luis told me to ignore it unless they sent it by certified mail. I did exactly that. That afternoon, I caught a few neighbors wandering past my yard and peering curiously at the new wall. One of them, a soft-spoken guy named Martin, gave me a thumbs up as he walked by. "Beautiful work," he said. "Been wanting to block her shortcut for years. You did what we all dreamed of." I realized then that this wasn't just about me. Karen had clearly been treating the neighborhood like her personal chessboard for a long time. My wall had done more than reclaim my backyard, it sent a message. A boundary had been restored, physically and symbolically. And Karen's game of shortcuts was officially over. For the first time in weeks, I grilled steaks that evening on the patio without the looming fear of a surprise Karen intrusion. No awkward waves. No poodle running through my roses. Just me, Rocky, the smell of good food, and the quiet dignity of bricks doing their job. The quiet didn't last long. By the following morning, my mailbox was stuffed with 3 envelopes from the HOA, all marked Urgent Violation Notification. I chuckled before even opening them. Inside, I found citations for excessive vegetation along eastern fence line, unauthorized permanent structure visible from shared pathways, and, my personal favorite, seasonally inappropriate yard ornaments, which, to be clear, referred to a Halloween gnome I never bothered to move. The pettiness was almost artistic. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind this sudden burst of neighborhood law enforcement. Karen wasn't just angry. She was retaliating, and she was using the HOA's rulebook like a blunt weapon. I scanned the letters, made copies, and immediately forwarded them to Luis. His response was immediate and scathing. "This is textbook harassment," he wrote. "Let's draft a cease and desist and attach documentation of the original trespass. Time to flip the script." That same afternoon, I began printing out every piece of evidence I'd gathered since Karen's gate stunt, photos of the construction, dated screenshots of texts where she all but bragged about the community shortcut, and video footage from my door camera showing her repeated trespasses through my yard with her little dog and self-appointed entourage. Each clip was clearer than the last. Karen had treated my backyard like a public sidewalk, and she didn't care who saw it. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't letting up. She skipped the passive-aggressive stage and went full offensive. She posted on the HOA community board online, painting herself as a victim of an antisocial neighbor with zero community spirit, claiming I had destroyed a shared access point and intimidated HOA members with aggressive behavior. I laughed out loud reading it. The woman had literally drilled into my fence, marched into my property, and now had the audacity to pretend she was under attack. But what struck me most wasn't just her audacity, it was how calculated it was. She knew that in HOA disputes, perception could be just as powerful as the rules themselves. That's when I decided it was time to control the narrative. I reached out to a few neighbors. Not all of them, just the ones I'd seen grimace when Karen was around. The retired couple next door, the young couple across the street, the middle-aged guy with the vintage car collection. I didn't ask them to take sides. I just invited them over for coffee and casually showed them the cease and desist I was filing. One by one, their eyebrows raised. Apparently, Karen had a reputation for similar behavior, abusing her HOA position to strong-arm neighbors, rerouting landscaping crews, even once threatening to fine someone for hanging a bird feeder without approval. The retired man, Greg, leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "She once tried to make me remove my flagpole because it wasn't HOA standard height. You're not the first, son. But you might be the last if you play this right." I realized then that I wasn't fighting this alone. The wall had become more than just bricks and mortar, it had sparked something. Neighbors were beginning to share their own frustrations, and the more they did, the more they understood that Karen's actions weren't about community spirit. They were about control. At the next HOA meeting, Karen strutted in with a clipboard and an expression like she'd already won. She took a seat at the front, flanked by 2 board members who looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. I arrived a few minutes later, with Luis beside me and a stack of documents neatly organized in a binder. As the meeting began, Karen launched into a prepared speech about unauthorized structures and non-compliant residents, her voice pitched with righteous authority. When she finished, I stood up slowly and flipped open the binder. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than anything. I calmly explained the timeline, her unauthorized construction of the gate, the lack of notice, the trespassing, the misuse of HOA funds to pay for materials that benefited only her, and the retaliatory citations. Each point was accompanied by images, receipts, videos, and even Karen's own social media posts bragging about her exclusive access. When I played the video of her walking a group of ladies through my yard saying, "It's fine, he won't mind, he's never home anyway," the room fell silent. Even the 2 board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen's eyes darted around the room, and I could see her starting to unravel. Then Louis stood up. Calm, professional, deadly. He laid out the legal ramifications of Karen's actions. Not just trespassing, but unauthorized alterations to private property, harassment, and violation of HOA protocols regarding construction approvals. He ended his statement by placing a copy of the cease and desist order on the table and letting it sit there like a bomb waiting to go off. Karen tried to respond. She stammered something about miscommunication, about me being uncooperative, about the gate being technically helpful to the neighborhood. But the tide had already turned. One neighbor spoke up, then another, and another. Stories poured out, each one more absurd than the last. Karen had fined someone for wind chimes. She'd had a teen written up for parking his bike in his own driveway. She once threatened to ban someone from the HOA pool for bringing chips instead of fruit to a community barbecue. It was like a dam had broken, and everything she'd done came rushing into the open. By the time the meeting ended, the HOA president had announced that a formal review of Karen's conduct would begin immediately. Her access to discretionary funds was frozen. She was suspended from board meetings until further notice. She walked out without saying a word, lips pressed in a line so tight it looked like her mouth had vanished entirely. I returned home that night to a dozen texts from neighbors thanking me, some even offering to pitch in for the wall. I politely declined. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. And as I sat on the patio, Rocky curled at my feet, I realized something important. Karen had underestimated me. She thought I'd be another silent pushover, someone too polite to fight back. But what she got instead was a neighbor who had the time, the patience, and the receipt. And now she was finding out what happened when you tried to turn someone's private yard into your personal walkway. The wall stood tall, unbothered by politics or petty power plays. It didn't yell or gloat. It simply did what it was built to do: protect what was mine and remind anyone who looked at it that boundaries, once enforced, are a beautiful thing. That night, a breeze rustled the trellis vines I'd planted on the wall, and I couldn't help but smile. Karen's games weren't over, not yet, but for once she wasn't the one setting the rules. Just when I thought the storm had passed and Karen would finally back off, she did what Karens do best: she doubled down. It started with a series of strange knocks on my door during odd hours. Once at 6 a.m., then again at 10:45 p.m. When I finally opened the door on the third attempt, Karen stood there holding a clipboard, wearing sunglasses and a trench coat like she thought she was some kind of neighborhood inspector. She announced she was conducting a follow-up review of my yard and wanted to take new photos for HOA documentation. I laughed out loud. She didn't take it well. After I told her to get off my property unless she had a court order or a valid reason recognized under our HOA charter, she stormed away, mumbling something about non-compliance. A few days later, a white truck from Animal Control pulled up to my house. The officer who stepped out looked almost embarrassed as he asked if I had unlicensed livestock. At first, I thought it was a joke. Then I realized he was serious. He gestured toward the report he had received, claiming someone had seen goats, possibly chickens, and a large aggressive canine in my backyard. I walked him around the yard, introduced him to Rocky, who rolled onto his back and wagged his tail like a puppy, and pointed out the only livestock present, a pair of decorative concrete pig statues near my garden bed. The officer chuckled, snapped a few pictures just to close the case, and said, "Looks like someone's trying to waste my time." I didn't even need to ask who filed the complaint. That evening, I went back through my security footage. Karen had walked by my property 3 times that week, each time pausing suspiciously at the side yard, occasionally snapping photos with her phone. I rewound the footage again and again, until one clip in particular caught my attention. Karen stood near the corner of my brick wall, trying to yank something loose. I zoomed in. She had a metal tool in one hand and was tugging at one of the decorative caps on the wall. After a few moments of struggle, She caught her bracelet on one of the trellis vines and nearly fell backward trying to free herself. I watched her stumble, pull the bracelet loose, then run off in frustration. That was the moment I realized I had gold. The footage was clear, well lit, and damning. She wasn't just harassing me anymore, she was actively vandalizing private property. That crossed a line, legally and morally. I clipped the video, edited it for clarity, and sent a copy to Luis. He called me within 10 minutes. This isn't just harassment now. That's attempted property damage. She's toast. I wasn't done there. I knew the HOA board had been wishy-washy. They were trying to avoid drama. But this? This was undeniable. I drafted an anonymous post and uploaded the footage to Reddit with the title, "Karen tried to tear down my backyard wall, didn't know I had security cameras." I tagged it under r/EntitledPeople. Within hours it blew up. Thousands of views. Hundreds of comments. People called her Wallbreaker Karen, the Fence Bandit, and one user hilariously dubbed her the Brick Thief. My inbox lit up with messages, some asking for updates, others simply sharing their own HOA horror stories. The exposure was electric. It was cathartic. It was also the perfect shield. Karen couldn't spin this in her favor, not when half the internet had already judged her and found her guilty of peak entitlement. The video even caught the attention of a local reporter who messaged me privately. She said she'd been covering neighborhood disputes and would love to do a light feature on homeowners dealing with HOA harassment. I declined the interview but agreed to share the footage with her, provided names and exact locations were left anonymous. She ran a piece 2 days later titled, "When Neighbors Go Too Far," and included a short snippet of the clip. I watched it on the local news with Rocky sitting beside me, wagging his tail every time they replayed Karen's stumbling retreat. Predictably, Karen lost her mind. She showed up at the next HOA meeting late, clearly flustered, and demanded to address the board. She launched into a tirade, claiming I had defamed her, violated her privacy, and engaged in cyberbullying. She even hinted at suing me for emotional distress. The room was quiet until I stood up and calmly asked if she was referring to the footage of her attempting to damage a legally constructed wall on private property. I then submitted a formal complaint to the board, this time with full video evidence and a notarized statement from Luis outlining the statutes Karen had violated. The board, which had been hesitant before, couldn't ignore it anymore. They announced an emergency vote on whether Karen's behavior warranted further disciplinary action. The motion passed almost immediately. Karen was barred from all HOA meetings for 60 days and stripped of her authority to issue citations or initiate board vote. Her access to community funds, project approvals, and HOA documents was frozen pending a full review. I should have felt victorious in that moment, and part of me did. But more than anything, I felt relief. For weeks, I'd been living under constant stress, checking my mail for more citations, watching the cameras like a hawk, wondering what new tactic Karen would try. But now, for the first time since the gate appeared, I felt like I could finally breathe. The neighbors began to notice the shift. People I barely knew stopped me during walks to say things like, "Good for you," and "It's about time someone stood up to her." The community that once seemed silent had found its voice again. One neighbor, the middle-aged guy with the vintage cars, even dropped off a six-pack on my porch with a note that said, "Thanks for building the wall, both kinds." I laughed harder at that than I had in weeks. Karen, for her part, was quiet, but not gone. She still lived just around the corner. I occasionally saw her walking her dog in the opposite direction, avoiding my street entirely. There was no smile, no smug wave, just a tight-lipped scowl and hurried steps. I wasn't naive enough to think she was finished. People like Karen don't let go easily. But the wall stood tall between us now, and no amount of passive-aggressive HOA memos could change that. One night, I sat out back under the string lights I'd recently installed along the top of the brick wall. Rocky rested beside me, snoring softly. I sipped my drink and watched the wind gently sway the vines climbing the trellis. The wall was more than a boundary now. It had become a part of the landscape, of the neighborhood, of the story we were all quietly telling. I thought about how something that started as an act of petty entitlement had turned into something far bigger, a stand. A line in the sand, built brick by brick, that said no more. And as I sat there in the quiet glow of that peaceful evening, I knew deep down that Karen's time as the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood was over. Her crown had cracked, and all the smug authority in the world couldn't fix it. She had underestimated the wrong neighbor, and now the entire block knew what happened when she pushed too far. The best part? I didn't have to yell, threaten, or fight. I just built a wall, and let the truth do the rest. The following weeks were strangely quiet, almost unnervingly so. Karen, once the self-declared sovereign of our street, had completely vanished from the neighborhood's daily rhythm. No more early morning marches with her clipboard. No more surprise citations slipped into mailboxes. No more unsolicited inspections. It was as if the wall hadn't just blocked access to my yard, it had blocked her from the community altogether. People began to smile more, linger longer outside, host casual porch conversations that weren't laced with gossip or fear of fines. The tension that once hovered over our street like a summer storm had finally broken, and I could feel the difference in the way neighbors now walked past my house and gave nods of acknowledgement that bordered on respect. One morning, while trimming the roses climbing along the trellis of the brick wall, I noticed a car I didn't recognize pulling into Karen's driveway. A well-dressed man stepped out with a briefcase, followed by a woman in a blazer holding a clipboard. They weren't delivery drivers. They had the unmistakable air of real estate agents. I kept pruning, pretending not to pay attention, but my ears were alert. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, Karen herself stepped outside, her usually firm posture now sagging under the weight of discomfort. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She looked smaller somehow. The woman who once stomped across my lawn like it was her stage was now quietly gesturing at the "for sale" sign being placed in her yard, her arms folded tightly as if to contain the last shreds of control she had. News of the sale traveled fast. By that evening, the HOA email list lit up with speculation and guarded optimism. A few of the more polite members mentioned wishing her the best, while others outright celebrated. One even posted a thank you meme with a cartoon brick wall wearing sunglasses. I didn't engage in the thread. I didn't need to. The wall had already done the talking. Karen's exit wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and inevitable, like a balloon slowly deflating. A week later, a young couple came to view the property. They waved at me from across the lawn, wide-eyed and full of that eager energy only first-time buyers have. The man was wearing a Star Wars t-shirt, and the woman had a "Support Local Farms" tote bag. Not exactly Karen's vibe. They walked the perimeter of the house, pausing briefly at the edge of my wall. The agent must have explained the situation because they both laughed and gave me a thumbs up. I took that as a good sign. That same day, a plain envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, just my name printed in shaky handwriting. I opened it cautiously, half expecting another complaint disguised as an apology. Inside was a single piece of stationery, the kind sold at those boutique shops that try too hard to look rustic. The note was written in tight, overly formal script. To Jason, while we have had our differences, I trust you'll agree things escalated beyond what was reasonable. I am choosing to move on and seek a community more aligned with my expectations. Best of luck in your future endeavors. That was it. No signature. No direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No apology. Just the most Karen exit letter imaginable. I chuckled, folded it neatly, and slid it into my folder of HOA drama for posterity. The following weekend, I hosted a barbecue. Nothing fancy. Just burgers, hot dogs, drinks, and good company. I sent out invites to the neighbors who had supported me quietly throughout the ordeal. Most came. Greg from next door brought potato salad, the young couple across the street brought drinks, and the vintage car guy surprised everyone by showing up in a convertible with a Bluetooth speaker blasting Motown. The vibe was light, relaxed, unbothered. No one tiptoed around lawn decor or questioned the height of flower bed. Kids played tag in the driveways. People leaned against the brick wall and joked about asking me to build one around the entire HOA office. As the sun set, I set up a projector screen in the backyard. We watched a slideshow I'd made called The Wall Saga, just a collection of photos and clips from the whole ordeal. It started with the infamous gate, moved through the late-night bricklaying, and of course featured the security footage of Karen's attempted sabotage. The laughter was genuine. There was a moment of collective healing in being able to laugh at what had once been such a stressful conflict. That night, under the soft glow of string lights and surrounded by people who now felt more like friends than neighbors, I realized that the wall hadn't just blocked Karen. It had built something else in her absence: community. The house eventually sold. I watched from the porch as Karen packed up her things. She never made eye contact. No goodbye. No parting shot. She climbed into her SUV, adjusted her sunglasses, and drove away as if nothing had happened. I watched her disappear around the bend, then turned to Rocky and whispered, "There goes the storm." The new neighbors moved in 2 weeks later. They introduced themselves immediately, bringing over muffins and asking about local food spot. I gave them a tour of the area, told them where the good produce was, and offered them copies of the HOA bylaws, highlighted for clarity. They laughed, asked about the wall, and I gave them the short version. A neighbor built a gate. I built a wall. She moved out. That's the whole arc. The man grinned. Honestly, that's the most HOA thing I've ever heard. I nodded. Welcome to the neighborhood. Life returned to normal. Real normal. The kind where you mow your lawn without wondering if someone's watching through binoculars. The kind where you leave a garden hose out for the afternoon and no one finds you. The kind where neighbors wave without judgment or ulterior motive. It was peaceful. Not because of the absence of conflict, but because the battle had been fought, and the right side had quietly won. One morning, months later, I stood at the edge of my yard admiring how far the vines had grown up the trellis. They'd taken to the wall beautifully, softening its presence and giving it character. What once looked like a barricade now resembled part of a home garden, covered in flowering clematis and curling ivy. It wasn't just functional anymore. It was beautiful. As I sipped my coffee, Rocky nudged my hand and looked toward the sidewalk. A couple was walking by, new faces, probably visiting family in the area. They paused at the wall, pointed to the plaque, and whispered something with amused expressions. I heard one of them say, "I think this is the wall from Reddit." I smiled to myself, took a long sip, and said nothing. I had built a wall to protect my yard. But in doing so, I'd exposed something bigger. That entitlement doesn't win when people stand their ground. That silence only feeds bullies. That even in the most mundane suburban settings, boundaries matter. Not just physical ones, but emotional and social ones too. And sometimes those boundaries need bricks. Not out of spite, not out of hate, but because peace isn't passive. Sometimes peace is built, one brick, one moment, one stand at a time. And when done right, it becomes something no Karen can tear down.